So you will recall that in yesterday's class, we discussed about the corporate governance framework in India. We identified as to what is the role of the directors in any company. So can anyone tell me what have you understood? What exactly is the role of directors in a company? Can anyone try to answer this question?
Um, uh,
Yeah, please go ahead.
Ma'am, they are kind of agents of shareholders who act as a guardian for the company.
Mm-hmm.
The directors are agents of shareholders who work as a guardians and overlook the functioning of any business or any other kind of organization.
Okay, okay. So as you can read in the slide over here, the primary duty as it is envisaged
Your phone
in
has
the,
no data connection, so I can't help you with that at the moment.
in the traditional way, how do we define the role of the director? So traditionally, as you rightly mentioned, that they have to maintain, they have to ensure that the interest of the shareholders are looked upon and fulfilled. In fact, if you recall, I mentioned about the great Milton Friedman, who said that the social responsibility of business is to increase the profit of the company. And he also emphasized on shareholders as the primary focus of any organization. But then, you see, if you look at the current scenario, there has been major change. I mean, if you just compare it to 60s and 70s when, Friedman and many of his other contemporary management professionals and economists talked about the primary role being related to profit making. So compared to that, there are many new dimensions which have been added to the global business scenario. So now there is open talk and discussion about climate change, the recent one being the Paris Declaration and how we need to really fulfill all the obligations, the focus on the environmental risk, the growing inequality, which has been highlighted more now because of the pandemic that the world is going through. And instead of, the situation getting better, it is getting worse and worse. So today, business leaders have been compelled to imagine their role beyond the service of the shareholders to that of the focus on being the society per se, and the organization is not just a profit generation entity, but it has a role which goes beyond that. Okay, so this is the reason why in our country we came up with the corporate social responsibility as an embedded part of a class of companies. So there is a regulatory framework which defines the CSR activities. But if you look at the global scenario, there are various formats, there are various initiatives. We'll talk about each one of them in detail when we move to Unit 3 and Unit 4. But for the time being, because we are talking about a new topic today, which has its origin to some extent in the corporate social responsibility, although we started the reference to business responsibility report as part of the SEBI directive in 2012 itself. But then when you talk about corporate social responsibility, you cannot just leave the business responsibility reporting. So today our focus will be on business responsibility reporting. But before we talk about the details of the Indian framework of business responsibility report, we will talk about some of the global initiatives which take into cognizance the aspect of the fulfillment of the responsibility towards society. Okay, so one of the most important initiative came from the Global Reporting Initiative, which is an independent international organization primarily looking after the interest of business as well as the different stakeholders. And they are primarily looking into business decisions from the perspective of sustainability issues. So what is the impact of a business decision on, let's say, sustainability, let's say on the human rights scenario? So this is what you call as the institution of the GRI, and they provide a mix of standards for information disclosure with respect to their commitment to sustainability, human rights, and employee interest. Okay, so basically, they seek information from the companies about the general management parameters, which includes information about profits as well, and some of the standards which make it in tune with the current requirements, such as the sustainability, human rights, etc. Then you have a UK based initiative. An international integrated reporting council was established in UK in 2010, and this again talks about certain principles, and these principles become the guideline for the disclosure which is given in the integrated report or IR. That is why we call it integrated reporting. So there is slight difference, because here they are not talking about standardized indicators, which is the case with most other sustainability reporting framework. Here the company is allowed to develop their own standards. So basically you need to identify which are the resources which are being used by the organization, and these resources are known as the capitals. So depending on the resources, depending on the significance of some parameters in their functioning, they can come up with their own indicators. So this is something similar to what you have in the ISO framework, where you see there are broad guidelines, but at the same time, the company will basically report what it identified as part of its declaration, and we only look at whether the company has been able to fulfill in terms of fulfill what it had documented or what it said it will do. So if there is any kind of deviation between what was promised and what is delivered, then that means there is a problem with respect to implementation of the quality standards. So it's something similar to that. Then you have what you call as the Carbon Disclosure Project. This again has its origin in United Kingdom, and again we have a network of investors and purchasers, and they have defined their own system of disclosure, and basically using these disclosures, whether it is a company or certain cities or states or regions, they can manage and they can measure their climate change impacts of whatever actions and decisions are being have been taken from time to time. So there is data about water, climate, forest. So then they will analyze this data, then they will rank and then publish the data online. So basically it is an online dashboard where stakeholders may report and view impacts of entities. Then you have ISO 26000. So we already know about the International Organization for Standardization, and I'm sure this you must have studied in your operations management course in the second semester, because you studied about quality management system. And if you talk about quality management system, then ISO is the organization to reckon with. So International Organization for Standardization launched this ISO 26000 guidelines in November 2010. And again, these are voluntary guidelines, and it is not actually some kind of certification or standard about social responsibility. India, in fact, is one of the countries where organizations have adopted the ISO 26000 to some extent, but again, it is not a mandatory requirement, and some organizations may give some information about what they do with respect to the green management, with respect to the protection of employees' right, collective bargaining, and also about the protection of the human rights of people, looking into health and so many other aspects of the employee and the community at large. Then you have the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board. This is again a United States of America initiative, and so the of course Sustainability Accounting Standard Boards is an independent non-profit organization, and there are 77 industry-specific standards. So depending on which industry a company is, it can make some disclosures. And primarily, it helps the public corporations in disclosing some of the important, significant material information, and some of the decisions which are, you know, important from the perspective of investors to make a call. So we already talk about impact investment, where we say that the investment is not just meant to generate the profit, but also to ensure that it makes an impact or a change in the life of people, maybe through what you call as the, you know, making a change or difference to the environment, or by providing some of the simple things like, you know, access to water, access to renewable energy, and you know, access to the proper infrastructure, which is vital for the economic development of any area or any region. So, you know, why I'm talking about all of these framework, because these framework in a way have influenced this particular initiative, which came from the Ministry of Corporate Affairs along with SEBI. So if you recall, in the previous two classes, we talked about the corporate governance, and we identified the primary role of the board, and we identified as to how the board has to discharge its duty in a way that they maintain the ethical standards and are looking at protection of the interest of the larger stakeholders. So here again, the focus is the same. This is an enabling mechanism. So one enabling mechanism is the institution of corporate governance, and this is the second enabling provision for doing good for the society, which we call as business responsibility report. So this initiative came up in 2012 when the Securities and Exchange Board of India asked the top 100 companies by market capitalization to file this report, which they called as the business responsibility report. And the idea was to enable the businesses to engage meaningfully with the stakeholders and go beyond the financial compliance and reporting, which of course was the focus in corporate governance. And later on, this was extended to the top 500 companies. And in March 2019, this has been extended in a way that top 1,000 listed companies by market capitalization have to now give the business responsibility report also from the year 2019-20. And we talked about the national voluntary guidelines in the previous class. So this again has its origin to the national voluntary guidelines, which take care of the economic responsibility, sustainability, and other parameters. So if you look at the business responsibility report, it has many sections. But what I will now ask you to do is that I'll give you a link. Okay, so you go through that link and you read the business responsibility report. So this is section E that you will have to read. So before we get back into that particular exercise, let us identify the core principles of business responsibility report, because that is what you have to read. Okay, so I'll give you a link. So go through the company report, read the business responsibility report, but focus only on the section which talks about principle wide, disclosures, and the fulfillment of obligations. So, what are those nine principles which were part of the National Voluntary Guidelines and now are the primary focus of business responsibility report? So, number one principle is that the businesses should conduct and govern themselves with ethics, transparency, and accountability. So, we have already discussed about corporate governance mechanism, which will ensure this. But then the organization should make a declaration that they conduct and govern their business with ethics, transparency, and accountability, and they have to then explain as to how they are able to ensure that. Second principle is that the business should provide goods and services that are safe and contribute to sustainability throughout their life cycle. We all make use of the mobile handset, and in recent past, what we find is that more and more companies have entered, and new models keep coming, and youngsters and even people like us sorry, so we keep switching over to the new model, the new product. So in the process, what we are doing is, whether it is laptop or whether it is mobile, we are creating a lot of what you call as the electronic waste. Now the question that needs to be asked is that what happens to the electronic waste? If you recall, earlier we discussed about how some of the companies such as Apple and Microsoft are trying to, collect the electronic waste, and how they are trying to ensure that they are treated properly in terms of recycling and reuse. But of course, the fact remains that not everything can be recycled and reused. So we create some waste. So the companies are responsible not just for the sale of a good, but also ensuring that we do not create any kind of carbon footprint while we are using the product and after we stop using the product. Third principle is that businesses should promote the well-being of the employees. Yesterday also I mentioned that ultimately it is the character and the commitment of the employee which is the foundation for good governance and reputation of the company. So there is a requirement to look after the well-being of the employees. So this means that employees have to be given opportunity for growth, for training, development, for their life after they fulfill their service obligation in the company, that is the pensionary benefit and the employees and their safety, their health. So all of these are the concerns of the organization. So report about how they are doing that is to be included. Then the fourth principle is business should respect the interest of and be responsive towards all stakeholders. So it's not just the employees but others also, especially those who are disadvantaged, vulnerable, and marginalized. So in our country, we have provision for reservation, which is a part of what you call as the affirmative action to take care of some of the disadvantaged section of the society. So that is one way. But then, for example, Tata Steel undertakes massive programs to take care of the rural community in and around Jamshedpur. That is Tata, where their two primary units, that is Tata Steel as well as the Tata Motors factories are established. Then the next one is that the business should respect and promote human rights. We have had the case of POSCO, where there was a major conflict with the local habitant of Orissa when it tried to set up the plant over there. They said the local people, they said that displacement from their place of abode is not right and is a violation of their basic human rights, and ultimately the project got delayed for a long time. Then the next is that the business should respect, protect, and make efforts to restore the environment. So I need not emphasize, it's all about the 3 R's of reuse, recycle, and reduce the use of the materials to the extent possible, so that we leave enough for the next generations. Then the seventh principle is that the businesses, when engaged in influencing public and regulatory policy, should do so in a responsible manner. We have discussed about lobbying, and we, saw the Radiagate video also in one of the previous classes. And what is expected is that, we also saw in Enron, there was a close nexus between the politicians, including the government of Mr. Bush, and the officials of Enron, and how they got patronage from them, and finally it resulted into a scenario where the shareholders, millions of shareholders, they lost all that they had. So the important thing is that whether it is the government entity, policymakers, or the corporate entity, they should all act in a responsible manner. Then the next one is that business should support inclusive growth and equitable development. And finally, that businesses should engage with and provide value to their customers and consumers in a responsible manner. So what products are being given, what are the messages that are being used to persuade the consumers, all of that, has to be under scrutiny. And so business needs to provide disclosures with respect to each of these principles. So we will stop at this point, and then we will follow it up with another activity. And that activity is something where you will be given a link. You have to read through the business responsibility report, and then we will have a discussion tomorrow when we meet about what has been reported and what are the salient component of a business responsibility report. We'll also talk about some of the recent changes in the format, because there has been a report which has made some changes into the way reporting has to be done. But the one that I'm sharing with you already has incorporated those changes, so it will be useful for